I've worked as a truck driver for over 15 years for various firms. By now, everything has gotten very routine. Take up the materials and items, check them for accuracy, and deliver them according to the directions. Since we don't get paid by the hour, productivity is crucial in this industry. As someone who has worked in this field for a long time, I like to think I can outwork the young people grabbing these positions. But this isn't necessarily a good thing. Usually, when it comes to getting by on very little sleep, I push myself to the very edge. I was employed by a North Dakota-based warehouse 4 years ago. In case you are unaware, North Dakota is among the states with the lowest elevations, which contributes to the ease of transportation. This implied that getting by on a few hours less sleep could spell the difference between landing a job and losing one. In May, it was a cool Tuesday morning. There was extra work for me at the beginning of the week because more loads needed to be shipped. I plotted my route into Montana with the intention of not stopping once to sleep because I intended to finish it all in one go. A few hours after lunch, I left to arrive at my destination early. I drove the semi as hard as I could the following morning, possibly exceeding the speed limit a few times. As the clock approached midnight, I recall wiping the crust from my eyelids. It was growing late. I clenched my teeth and continued driving even though I was having problems keeping my eyes open. I only had about an hour remaining on this drive. The use of smelling salts was first introduced to me by my trucker friend Tristan. When I initially got started. Smelling salts are essentially crystals in a small vial, for those who are unaware. You're wide awake after only one smell. But you need to exercise caution. From what Tristan advised me, doing too many backs and back uses can be hazardous. I used to reach for the smelling salts first anytime I needed a pick-me-up, even though they do burn your nose a little. That was the situation at hand. I threw back my head after taking a deep inhale. My instinct is to take charge. I hoped that the rush of adrenaline would continue throughout the remainder of the drive. Half an hour went by, and I was having a lot of trouble. I was about to nod off when I felt Blair from my truck accidentally bumps into my shoulder. It was becoming risky here. I felt that I needed to leave. On the highway, I was alone myself, and there was nowhere to pull off. Maine was surrounded by nothing but woods. With my headlights piercing the darkness and allowing me to see much more, I slowed down the truck and urgently glanced around for somewhere to pull over. It was then that I noticed something that perplexed me. A purple dress was lying in the center of the street. How in the hell? Rubbing my eyes, I thought. Had I lost my mind? I must have blinked 6 times to be sure I wasn't dreaming. It was authentic. I rolled up to the outfit and stood there staring at it with my truck. In retrospect, there ought to have been more of a warning sign, but I believe I was simply too tired to comprehend what was happening when, from 200 yards or so, I passed a pair of shoes. I was getting a little crazy now. What on earth was happening? I prayed to God as I walked by the shoes, hoping that there would be a spot to stop soon. I held onto my old man David's ancient crucifix and prayed that he would make it through since he was a deeply religious man. Me. I noticed some more strange clothes a little ways up the road, some of which appeared to be for small children. When I stopped the truck this time, fear took hold. There was a serious problem. I was sitting in the driver's seat and the truck was at a complete stop. I followed my intuition since I was anticipating something to happen, but it never occurred. After getting out of the truck, I went to go over the clothes. The sensation of the crisp morning air penetrating my skin is still vivid in my mind, and it certainly relieved some of my fatigue. I took as much care as I could as I approached the pile. Yes, that was kids' clothing. They appeared to be a boy and a girl. Clothes fragments piled up. I peered into the trees, but the darkness made it difficult for me to see much. I was concerned that this might be a trap, so I kept my head turned to the side. I returned to my pickup, deciding it was none of my business to investigate further. I heard a crunch come from the left at that moment. I quickly turned to see what was there. I remained motionless, anticipating the next noise. A second or two later, there was another crunch, but this time it came from the other side of the street. My survival instincts took over, and I bolted for the truck. I heard a child scream out as I dove into the front seat, but before I could shut the door, I heard them. I froze, my heart at the crossroads, exploding out of my chest. I couldn't just leave some defenseless children behind, but I also couldn't fight some random individuals in the middle of the night in the woods. Another child's nearly identical scream broke out before I could decide what to do. I turned on the vehicle without thinking, pointing its nose in the direction of the area of the woods where I'd heard the commotion. 30 yards or so into the woods, my headlights came on. 3 or 4 persons were present. One of them was carrying a large speaker. They hid behind a few trees as my truck passed by. Display them. However, I had given them enough exposure for me to see what they were up to. Before I could make out any distinguishing features, they fled from the light, but I swear on my old father David's death that they were luring me into the woods with the pretend children yelling while holding up a speaker. I was merely stunned. I sat looking out at the trees. Those folks had only slipped behind. I grabbed my phone to call the police, but before I could get the call through, I heard something thrown from the other way hit the truck's body with a thump. I had finished. I put my head back on the road and floored it. I could see someone on the other side of the road as I sped away. He gave me a non-intelligible cry, then threw something at the truck that shattered the glass in my passenger side window. I drove silently for the last hour. I was too terrified to think about what had happened, but I was not going to stop and spend the night in those woods. After finishing my delivery, I passed out. I think I slept for 10 hours non-stop. I called the police as soon as I woke up, and they promised to look into those woods and let me know if there were any changes. I then considered how foolish I had been to become involved in the whole thing. Removed. I should have just kept my mouth shut about my truck. However, I couldn't overlook the possibility that some children were abducted or worse. I still don't know what those individuals were attempting to accomplish. I'm not sure what they were going to do to me if I fled out in the woods, or why they didn't just rush me when they had the chance. Nothing has ever been as weird or outright scary as this encounter, even after the kids screamed, in all my years as a truck driver. You've probably seen some of the more recent videos that truckers post online where they chronicle their everyday activities and give advice to one another. Or perhaps you haven't, but every time I open TikTok, I realize that I'm among the younger people in this field. That's all I see when it comes to YouTube Shorts. I won't get into it, but for personal reasons, I had to leave a fairly prominent university, and people always tell me I could have done better than being a truck driver. Still, it's not a horrible job. I've been delivering things for more than 2 years. The long hours are the only physically demanding aspect of the job. Without going through the solitude yourself, you can never really predict how it will impact you. The only thing I could suggest is to reconcile with any demons that may be living in your subconscious, as they will undoubtedly consume your mind while you're by yourself. Time and hours. In any case, that's what occurred to me. 3 months after I started working for my first employer, I experienced this. I was about as new as it gets in this trade. Obtain. 12 hours of driving may not sound like much, but keep in mind that I had just finished an 8-hour excursion. I was traveling from southern New Jersey to Lafayette, Indiana. I decided to drive through the night to complete deliveries as soon as feasible. By early morning, I would arrive in Lafayette. Everything was going according to plan. I was able to push the truck a little faster than usual because there were hardly any other automobiles on the route. I seem to remember reaching down to drink a Red Bull from the center console about midway through the drive, but there weren't any. Of course, when I finished my last delivery, I forgot to fill my truck again. I sighed in frustration after slamming my dashboard many times since I knew I would have to quit eventually. Making stops was the one thing I detested the most. While I'm driving, I may be the only one, but whenever my car is in the drive while on the go, I always feel like I'm running on empty. After looking at the map for a mere 20 seconds, I realized I had no choice but to either stop and grab an energy drink or go to sleep on the road. Those choices were essentially interchangeable. I reluctantly turned into the first available service station. I was completely clueless about my whereabouts. At this point, probably someplace in Ohio. I discovered too late that this was not a true service stop. It appeared to be a converted convenience shop and an abandoned petrol station. I doubt there's a more accurate description. To be honest, I was expecting one of two things when I parked the semi and headed over to the first convenience store. Either way, it appeared like there was another quick stop store not far up the road, so I decided I'd go there if anything. The door would be locked or the location would be unlocked. You can imagine how shocked I was when the door opened. Opened to reveal a completely dark store. And cast a glance around, hoping that if I was lucky, someone would have left behind a drink or some food. As I was going to turn around, I noticed a faint glimmer coming from the corner of the room as my eyes grew used to the darkness. As I approached it, I could see that some type of back room was the source of the brightness. My curiosity overcame me, and I cautiously opened the door to my delightful surprise. A refrigerator stood against the wall, plugged in. I opened the door eagerly, but nothing was there. Absolutely nothing. The entire appliance had been taken apart as if the shelves had been taken out. I was 90% sure I heard it clatter from the main room as I was closing the door. Similar to something striking the ground. For a good 10 seconds, I was frozen. Was that something I imagined? There was not a chance. I returned to the main room quietly and took in my surroundings. Nothing. A part of me wanted to look into it more. Still, I didn't have time for this. I practically rushed to the other store after leaving the front door. Thank heavens, it was open. After paying for my drink, I headed back. My car. There was something off about this entire stop. I had to return to driving as soon as possible. When I gave the abandoned store one last look, I saw that the door was now open. I was convinced that I had closed it. Me behind. Though it wasn't my responsibility to investigate, I turned on the engine and merged my truck back. Enter the freeway. I was instantly startled out of my drowsy stupor by the caffeine's kick. My thoughts drifted off and I realized how strange the entire situation had been. I suppose a squatter in an abandoned building wasn't the most bizarre thing ever, but no matter what explanation I tried, my brain was unable to explain that refrigerator. I drove on, trying to push it from my mind. That's when I noticed the curtain behind me and strange motions. I could feel the sweat trickling down my brow. I didn't have the air on, but I watched in the rearview mirror as the curtain appeared to billow and move. At worst, I believed that there was a person inside my truck. Since I was carrying no weapons, I used my phone to subtly dial the number of the closest police station. The most terrifying and nervous 20 minutes of my life were on the journey there. Life. I couldn't stop picturing somebody trying to smash my truck or reaching out to grab me. At last, I came up to the police station. I pulled off as close to the end as I could. Could get there in a matter of seconds and practically rushed to the police station. Police surrounded my truck, and when I opened the rear, I saw something that will never leave my memory. 2 males and 1 lady who appeared to be homeless were taken out by the police. They had shabby blankets covering them and were dressed in rags. 2 switchblades were carried by one of the males. They all 3 remained silent and gave me a frightening look as they approached. To the left. I'm not sure what their desires were. I doubt I will ever find out. I've worked as a truck driver for about 15 years. I experienced this in 2017. I was traveling to an Arizona location while operating an overnight haul in California's Mojave Desert. I believe I was bringing in appliances. I honestly can't recall. In all directions, there was utter blackness. At the time, my semi's headlights were quite dim, and I had been putting off having them changed. At all. Normally I couldn't detect the difference, but it was much more noticeable now as there weren't any other cars on the road. Every few minutes, I recall having to squint my eyes to see the distant road, which may have been a horror story in itself. Though I didn't want to waste time, I debated stopping for a few hours and watching for sunrise. I continued driving even though it wasn't entirely safe since I needed the money badly at the moment. It was almost a straight line, so I assumed it would be day. I believe it was an hour or so before dawn when I noticed something moving quickly toward us in the distance. Fearful of colliding with an animal, I shut up. Apply the brakes. My truck jerked to a stop, and that's when I saw what was ahead of me. An automobile with the hazards activated. It was actually on the double yellow, right in the middle of the road, which made it extremely strange. The passenger door was ajar, which made the situation extra strange. My pickup came to a stop just a foot or so shy of it. Not to brag, but I'm a rather daring man, and as a result, I know how to handle myself in a bar fight. When I first saw the car, I wasn't too afraid. I was primarily inquisitive. I reversed the lorry and pulled over, thinking maybe someone needed a jump or something. As there wasn't a single other automobile on the route, I considered setting off some flares, but changed my mind. In addition to this, when I exited my truck and walked toward the vehicle, the night was pleasant and calm. I distinctly recall finding it odd that there wasn't much wind. That night, it was also incredibly silent. All that could be heard in what seemed like the whole desert was the faint click of the hazards. I approached it a little more. The vehicle. I still clearly recalled that it was a red Ford Fusion that looked brand new. I took a slightly cautious approach to the car. The passenger door was ajar, as previously mentioned. I stepped around the vehicle and came to a stop. It was utterly vacant. I double-checked it, looking under the back seat and wherever else that someone might have been lying down. Suddenly, there was no one inside, and I was even less certain of the circumstances. I thought maybe someone who had fallen asleep in a stupid place would need the assistance of some kind. Still, I didn't anticipate this. The car was empty. I glanced over my shoulder a few times, feeling much more nervous now. I continued to shake my head, scanning all directions. I had the impression that I was going to be charged. The issue was that, except for what my truck's headlights lit up, I couldn't see very far in front of me because it was so dark. It was unsettling. I waited for a little bit longer, considering returning to my truck and disregarding the entire situation. Somewhere out there was a person. I chose to continue looking into it despite my better judgment. When I peered inside the car, everything appeared to be how it should be. Even the ignition key was in place. I got out of the car again and headed somewhere even though the engine was off. To the over. I figured the trunk might as well have a peek. I moved to give it a look. But locked, it would not budge. I extracted the ignition key and opened the trunk. It was jammed from the inside out, though, and would not budge. I opened the rear door somehow and attempted to access the trunk from the back. Place. I was shocked to see that it did open. Back there were 3 squashed trash bags and a rope fastening the trunk shut. I seemed to have looked over my shoulder one more time before reaching for them. It was clear sailing. The loudest gunshot I've ever heard blasted out into the night, and it had to have been no more than 5 inches from one of the bags. I forcefully struck my head against the car's top. Make a knock. I did not even consider it. I threw the keys on the front seat and hurriedly exited the vehicle to get into my semi. Somewhere, a gritty voice could be heard shouting. He shouted. He said, "Hey," several times, and his voice appeared to be getting closer. After clambering inside the semi, I switched it on. I shifted into gear as quickly as I could. When the engine first stalled, I seemed to have cursed a lot, and that's why I noticed it. Just as my vehicle started to move, I noticed someone standing beside the car's trunk. It was a red-haired, short, husky guy. In his left hand, he had shin-high boots and overalls. To his right, he carried a little shovel, but to his left, an antiquated-looking hunting rifle. For a little moment, we were staring at each other while my truck passed him by. He remained still. I recall that he didn't appear insane or anything. As I walked by him, he had this anxious expression on his face. He put down his shovel and began to gesture with his hands. He shouted. I drove away, telling them to wait a few more seconds before leaving. He followed my truck for a short while before making a quick retreat, which I observed through the rearview mirror. His vehicle. He was trying to get me to stop, but I was not going to. To carry out. that I pushed the vehicle far faster than I ought to have by stepping on it. After about 5 minutes of driving, I thought I was safe, but then I noticed headlights rapidly approaching from behind. I can still remember feeling the most fear I have ever experienced in my life. I informed the police over the phone about what had happened. Finest of. When the automobile was essentially right on my trail, that's when I used my ability. It began to honk loudly at me. Since I had no idea what to do, I merely drove on, hoping without hope that he wouldn't try to flee me. This continued for about 15 minutes when he cut in front of me and applied the brakes, which made me slow down. I was ready to collide with him when, at last, some police lights began to flash in the distance. The Ford lost sight of itself as it turned to the right and accelerated into the desert. I waited for the cop to arrive after I pulled over. I raced to him and told him what had happened, but instead of pursuing the useless cop, he chose to get a report from me. I felt down about that. I think I told the guy twice that if he went, he could probably catch up to him. The policeman now assured me not to worry and that a thorough search would be conducted right away. The backup showed up. He stated they would give me a call if they had any updates and then send me on my way. They never did. I've told my friends about this more times than I can remember, yet none of them had a story as bizarre. You're undoubtedly thinking that this man was burying bodies, and I understand that. That doesn't work that way. Tell me why he attempted to follow or why he had such a small shovel. Me. The sacks in his trunk were also too little for that, and I like to believe that he was burying some other kind of animal, even though some of my friends believe he may have dismembered me for my mental health. Perhaps euthanizing a sick dog or some potentially harmful snakes? I have no idea. In any case, this event made me never feel completely at ease when traveling across deserts at night.